Not was the moment I understood what my grandfather had been trying to teach me my entire life. The morning light came through the tall windows of the study in long pale strips, falling across the dark oak desk where Mr. Caldwell had arranged his papers into 3 neat stacks. I remember thinking how strange it was that everything looked so ordinary. The clock on the mantel still ticked. The smell of old books and cedar still hung in the air. Outside, a cardinal was singing in the magnolia tree my grandfather had planted the year my mother was born. Everything was exactly as it had always been, and yet nothing would ever be the same again. I was sitting in the chair closest to the window. My brother was to my left, and his wife was beside him with her hand resting on his forearm the way she always did when she wanted something. My sister-in-law had worn perfume to a funeral. I noticed it in the church, and I noticed it again now. Something expensive and sharp, the kind that announces itself before you walk into a room. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and looked at my brother over the rim of his glasses. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to ask a question. Have both of you read General Harlan's will in its entirety?" My brother said yes without hesitating. I had not been given a copy to read. My grandfather's name was General Raymond Harlan, retired United States Air Force, 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and more commendations than he ever talked about. He kept them in a box in the closet of his study, not on display. I only found them once, when I was 12 and looking for extra batteries. I asked him about the medals, and he said, "Sophie, the men who deserved those things more than me never got to come home to receive them." Then he closed the box and we went downstairs for dinner, and he never mentioned it again. That was who he was. He raised me after my parents divorced, and my mother moved to Portland with a man named Derek who made it clear from the beginning that he had not signed up for a ready-made family. My father had his own complications, his own apartment across town, his own reasons for not showing up to things. My brother Daniel was 7 years older than me and had already left for college by the time everything fell apart, so he missed the worst of it. He got the version of our family where things were still mostly holding together. I got the version that came after. My grandfather drove 2 hours to pick me up on a Tuesday in October. I was 14 years old, sitting on the porch with a garbage bag of clothes because my mother had forgotten it was her week. He didn't say anything about that when he arrived. He put the bag in the trunk, he took me to a diner on the way home, and he ordered me a grilled cheese and a milkshake and asked me what subject I liked best in school. I said, "Biology." He said that was a good choice. We talked about how the human heart worked for the next 40 minutes, and he never once mentioned my mother or my father or the garbage bag in the trunk. That was the night I decided I wanted to go to medical school. He supported that decision the same way he supported everything I did, which was quietly and completely. He drove me to SAT prep on Saturday mornings. He read my personal statements and wrote notes in the margins in his precise, careful handwriting. When I got into Johns Hopkins, he made a reservation at the nicest restaurant in Charlottesville and took me to dinner and ordered a bottle of champagne and gave a toast so thoughtful and specific to who I was as a person that the couple at the next table started crying. He was not a man who said "I love you" easily. He showed it through attention. He showed it by remembering. He showed it by driving 2 hours on a Tuesday to pick up a 14-year-old girl who nobody else had remembered to pick up. I finished my residency in general surgery at the University of Virginia Medical Center. I moved into the cottage at the back of my grandfather's property so I could be close to him as he got older. The cottage needed work when I moved in. The kitchen faucet dripped, the back door didn't close right in winter. But my grandfather and I spent 3 weekends fixing it together. He was 78 years old and he was still useful with his hands. We had coffee every morning on the porch between the main house and the cottage. That was our routine for 4 years. Daniel visited twice a year, Easter and Christmas. He and his wife Renata would stay for a long weekend, eat my grandfather's food, sit in my grandfather's living room, and then drive back to their house in Northern Virginia and return to their real lives, which did not appear to include us. I do not say that with bitterness. I say it because it is important later. My grandfather was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 18 months before he died. He knew what it meant. He had watched his own father go through it. He made arrangements quietly and carefully the way he did everything, and he told me in the same matter-of-fact way he told me most things. "Sophie," he said one morning over coffee, I want you to know my affairs are in order. I've worked with Mr. Caldwell on everything. You don't need to worry. I told him I wasn't worried about affairs. I was worried about him. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, I know. That's why I told you. In his final 6 months, I adjusted my schedule at the hospital so I could be home before dark. I drove him to his cardiology appointments. I learned to cook the meals his doctor recommended, the low-sodium ones he complained about every single time, with a precision and creativity of complaint that I found genuinely admirable. He started losing weight in the last 2 months. He slept more, but his mind stayed sharp, and his opinions stayed strong, and he continued to beat me at chess every Thursday night without showing any mercy whatsoever. He died on a Wednesday morning in February in his own bed, in his own house, with me holding his hand. Daniel arrived that afternoon. Renata came the next day. The funeral was at a church in Charlottesville that my grandfather had attended for 40 years. Half the Air Force seemed to show up, men and women in uniform I had never met, who spoke about my grandfather with a familiarity and love that told me there were entire chapters of his life I only knew the outline of. A colonel named Margaret Webb gave the eulogy and said that Raymond Harlan was the kind of man who made you want to be better simply by being in the same room with him. That sounded right to me. Daniel stood next to me at the reception afterward, accepting condolences, shaking hands. He was good at that. He had always been good at the public parts of things. Renata moved through the room in her good black dress, introducing herself to people, making sure they knew she was family. I stood near the window and ate a small plate of food someone handed me and thought about my grandfather's hands. That night, back at the house, Daniel and Renata sat in the kitchen and talked about the property. Not about my grandfather. About the property. Renata had a number in her head already. She mentioned it casually, the way you might mention the weather, and then she mentioned it again, slightly less casually, an hour later. My grandfather's house was an 11,000-square-foot estate on 14 acres outside Charlottesville, Virginia. It had been appraised at just under $9 million 2 years earlier. There was also a significant investment portfolio and a collection of military antiques that a dealer had once described as museum quality. I went to bed early. The cottage felt different that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the main house and tried to understand that there was no one in it anymore. The meeting with Mr. Caldwell was 3 days after the funeral. His office was in downtown Charlottesville, 3rd floor of a building on the downtown mall, with tall windows that looked out onto the brick pedestrian street below. He was a careful man, precise in his movements, with the manner of someone who has delivered difficult news in professional settings for many years and has learned to do it without flinching. He had arranged 3 chairs in front of his desk. Daniel and Renata took 2 of them. I took the 3rd. Mr. Caldwell opened the folder on his desk and looked at my brother over the rim of his glasses. Before we begin, he said, I want to ask a question. Have both of you read General Harlan's will in its entirety? Daniel said yes. I said I had not been given a copy. Mr. Caldwell looked at me for a moment and wrote something on the notepad beside the folder. Then he nodded and began to read. The primary estate, the house, the land, the investment portfolio, the vehicle, the antiques collection, was left to Daniel. That was the first part. Daniel's posture changed when he heard it. He sat up slightly straighter. Renata's hand moved on his forearm. I had expected something like this. My grandfather and I had never discussed the specifics of his will. I had never asked. The thought of asking had felt wrong to me, the same way it would have felt wrong to count someone's silverware while they were still alive and in the next room. Mr. Caldwell continued reading. The cottage where I lived was left to me outright, along with a generous cash inheritance. And then he paused. It was a very brief pause, the kind the careful man makes before he says something important. He turned a page. He looked at the document, and then he looked at my brother. There is an additional provision, he said. General Harlan added an amendment to this will 14 months ago. It is legally binding and was witnessed and notarized by 2 independent parties. He looked down at the document. The amendment states the following, that the primary estate and all associated assets will transfer to his granddaughter, Sophie Christine Harlan, if the primary beneficiary, Daniel Harlan, takes any action within 60 days of the general's passing that is in violation of the conditions of care outlined in Appendix C. Daniel's posture changed again, this time in the other direction. What conditions? He said. Mr. Caldwell turned to the appendix. My grandfather, it turned out, had been paying close attention for a very long time. The conditions were specific. They required that Daniel either continue to allow me to reside in the cottage at my current arrangement or provide 6 months of notice and relocation assistance. They required that Daniel maintain the charitable donation schedule my grandfather had established with 3 organizations he had supported for over 2 decades. And they required that Daniel make no alterations to my grandfather's study, the books, the papers, the photographs, for a period of 1 year. Renata made a sound that was not quite a word. Daniel turned to look at her and then turned back to Mr. Caldwell. My grandfather added this 14 months ago, Daniel said. Yes? And you didn't think to tell us? Mr. Caldwell looked at my brother with an expression of complete professional calm. Your grandfather's instructions were explicit. The amendment was to be disclosed at this reading in this room after the primary provisions were read. I followed those instructions precisely. He paused, as I would expect anyone who understood your grandfather to understand. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, We'll need time to review this. Of course, Mr. Caldwell said. You have 30 days to acknowledge the conditions in writing. I drove back to the cottage in silence. I sat in my car in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. The main house was dark. The magnolia tree was bare in the February cold. I thought about my grandfather sitting with Mr. Caldwell 14 months ago. I thought about what he must have been thinking. He had known by then about his diagnosis. He had known what the trajectory looked like. And he had sat down with his attorney and added those words to his will with the same quiet precision with which he had done everything else in his life. He had been watching. He had understood something. I had only suspected and never said out loud, because saying it out loud had felt disloyal. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. Can we talk tonight? I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and went inside. He came to the cottage at 7 o'clock. Renata did not come with him. He stood in my kitchen with his coat still on and his hands in his pockets, and he looked like a man who had spent several hours deciding what to say and had not quite landed on it yet. I want you to know, he said, that we were never going to ask you to leave. I put the kettle on because I needed something to do with my hands. Daniel, I said, I mean it. I know you mean it now, I said. Right now, in this moment, you mean it. He looked at the floor. He was 51 years old, and he looked, for just a moment, like the 22-year-old version of himself I remembered from childhood holidays, the one who used to seem older and more certain than anyone I had ever met. He didn't trust me, Daniel said. I turned to face him. He loved you, I said. He was proud of you. He talked about your career to everyone who came to this house. He kept the newspaper article about your promotion in his desk drawer. I paused. But he also paid attention. That's what he did. He paid attention to everyone, all the time, and he took notes. And after 31 years in the Air Force, he understood exactly what people were capable of when significant resources were involved. I took a breath. He wasn't making a judgment. He was making a plan. Daniel didn't say anything. He made a plan for me when I was 14 years old and sitting on a porch with a garbage bag, I said. He made a plan for you too. He was protecting both of us. He was protecting you from being the person who would have eventually asked me to leave, and he was protecting me from having to watch it happen. The kettle started to whistle. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table. I made 2 cups of tea and put one in front of him and sat across from him, the same way my grandfather had sat across from me at a diner on a Tuesday night in October 18 years ago, and we talked for the first time in years about who our grandfather actually was. I want to tell you about the letter, because the letter is the part I think about most. 3 weeks after the reading of the will, a manila envelope arrived at the cottage by certified mail. My name was on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. Mr. Caldwell had held it per the general's instructions to be mailed 21 days after the reading. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No preamble, no greeting. Just his handwriting. precise and even, in blue ink. Sophie, you already know everything I'm about to say. You've known it since you were 14 years old, and you figured out that the most important thing in a room is usually the thing nobody is talking about. The house was never the point. The money was never the point. I spent 31 years watching people confuse resources for meaning, and I refuse to let that happen to my family. What I am leaving you is not the cottage. I am leaving you the proof. Proof that I saw you. Proof that I knew exactly who you were, and I was paying attention, and none of it was ever lost on me. You never asked me for anything. You never needed to. You just showed up, quietly and completely, every single day, and you thought I didn't notice. I noticed everything. The greatest inheritance is not the thing you receive, it's the character you built while you were waiting to see whether you would receive anything at all. Grandpa, I kept the conditions of the will, not because I had to. By the time 30 days had passed, Daniel had signed the acknowledgement and submitted it to Mr. Caldwell, and the question of what would happen to the estate had been settled. I kept the conditions because they were the right thing to do. I kept donating to my grandfather's 3 charities. I kept the study exactly as he had left it for the full year. The books on their shelves, the photographs on the walls, his handwriting still visible on the notepad he'd left beside the telephone. I still have coffee on the porch every morning. Renata surprised me. About 2 months after the reading, she called me and asked if I would show her around the house. The real house, not the public rooms, but the parts that mattered. I walked her through my grandfather's study. I showed her the medals in the box in the closet. I showed her the newspaper article in the desk drawer, the one about Daniel's promotion, saved and folded with care. She didn't say much during the tour, but when we came back to the kitchen, she sat down and she said, "He really loved Daniel, didn't he?" I said yes. "He really did." She nodded. Then she said, "I think I made some assumptions about this family that I should probably reconsider." That was more self-awareness than I had expected from her, and I told her I respected it. We are not best friends, but we are fine. We are more than fine. There is a photograph on the wall of my cottage. It is the only new thing I have hung since my grandfather died. It is a photograph of the 2 of us, taken about 2 years before his diagnosis, on the porch between the main house and the cottage, coffee cups in hand, early morning light coming through the magnolia tree. I am laughing at something. He is looking at me with the expression I knew better than any other expression in my life, the one that meant he was paying attention, the one that meant he was taking a note somewhere in that careful, precise mind of his. When I come home from long shifts at the hospital, sometimes I stop in front of that photograph for a moment before I do anything else. Not because I am sad, though sometimes I am, but because it reminds me of something he told me the week before he died, when we were sitting on that same porch in the February cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the bare branches of the magnolia tree move in the wind. I had asked him if he was afraid. He thought about it for a long moment, the way he always thought about things, and then he said no. Afraid would mean I thought I'd wasted it. I don't think I wasted it. He looked at the tree. The only real question anyone has to answer at the end is whether the people you loved knew that you loved them. He turned and looked at me. "You know." I told him I knew. "Then I'm not afraid," he said. The cardinal came back this spring. It nests in the magnolia tree every year, and I have decided that this is not a coincidence. I know it is a coincidence. I am a surgeon with a medical degree from one of the finest institutions in this country, and I understand perfectly well how cardinals and magnolia trees work. And yet, every morning when I come out to the porch with my coffee and he is there in the branches, I say good morning, and I sit down, and the day begins the way it always did, quietly in the company of someone who saw me and paid attention and never once let me forget that I was known. That was the inheritance. That was always the inheritance.